"You can't stay here, Dad. Not with $10 to your name." The words hung in the kitchen like frost on a window. I stood beside the chip counter, steam curling from the coffee mug in my hand. Bitter scent, strong enough to wake the dead, rose into my face, but it couldn't cut through what I just heard. I looked straight at him. "Come again?" "You heard me," Trevor said, leaning on the fridge like he owned it. "You've got $10. That's all. You can't freeload anymore." I'd bought him this house. 2 years ago I signed my name on the mortgage. The same yellow walls that once felt warm now seemed to press in, the paint dull under the gray November light. Outside, wind scraped the bare maple branches against the siding. Somewhere down the block, a snow shovel scraped pavement. I set the mug down on the counter. The clink echoed in the too-quiet room. My thoughts ran wild. I'd paid his tuition. I'd fixed his truck in the rain. I'd sat up nights holding his newborn when he was too tired. And now my own son was throwing me out. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. He shrugged. "That's not my problem." A sharp ache crept up my spine. Beside him, his girlfriend Camila crossed her arms, eyes flicking over me like she was pricing an old chair. She didn't speak, but the message was loud enough. I reached for my coat on the chair. Cold fabric, faint smell of last week's snow. I pulled it on slowly, letting the silence stretch. $10 in my wallet. No keys. He'd borrowed my truck last winter, for a week, and never gave it back. Stepping out, the cold slapped my cheeks. Breath fogged in front of me as I walked down the narrow driveway. The maple branches groaned overhead in the wind. Behind me, the door shut with a final click. I headed toward Main Street. Boots crunched over patches of ice. The sun was already dipping behind Bitterroot Mountain, casting long blue shadows over the snow. I passed the diner, smell of fried onions spilling into the street. Inside, people laughed over plates of pie. I kept walking. 2 blocks down, I stopped under a flickering street lamp. The bus stop bench was cold steel, paint worn thin where hundreds of hands had gripped it. I sat, feeling the ache in my knees spread. My mind drifted to another bench, 2 years earlier. Different day, same cold. That time, I'd been standing outside the county office, after signing papers that gave Trevor this house. He'd hugged me then, said I was the best dad a man could have. Funny how words can rot faster than apples. A bus hissed to a stop. I didn't get on. Not yet. I still had one place in this town that was mine. A place Trevor had never seen. A place he didn't even know existed. I thought about the key, heavy brass worn smooth, sitting in the back pocket of my old hunting jacket. That jacket was hanging in the closet of the mountain lodge I'd bought with the last of my savings 5 years back. It had stayed closed to guests for months now, but it was still mine. Every log, every nail. They thought they'd stripped me bare. But they'd only taken what I let them see. Snow began to fall, soft at first, flakes catching in the street lamp glow. I pulled my collar up, tucking my chin into the warm wool. My pulse slowed. Anger cooled into something sharper. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to explain. I was going to watch. Move when the time was right. The bus pulled away without me. Its red taillights vanished into the swirl of snow. I rose, boots crunching, and headed toward the dark stretch of road that led to the lodge. The wind was in my face, but the thought of that key in my jacket pocket warmed me. This wasn't the end. Not even close. What would you do if your own child pushed you out with nothing? A. Stay silent and keep giving. B. Gently express how you feel. C. Accept it as part of being a parent. D. C. Step back to protect your heart. The wind pushed at my back as I left Main Street behind. Snow clung to my hair and melted down the collar of my coat. Each step toward the lodge felt longer, heavier, dragging me deeper into a past I hadn't meant to open tonight. I could still see Trevor at 8 years old, kneeling on the worn pine floor of our old cabin. A block of cedar sat between his knees, the shavings curling at his feet like pale ribbons. "Keep the blade steady," I'd told him, guiding his small hands around the handle of my old carving knife. The smell of fresh wood filled the room, mixing with the tang of stew simmering on the stove. We didn't have much back then, but every winter night felt like a small victory. Heat from the fire, snow piling against the window, and the boys' laugh bouncing off the rafters. Years later, I watched him cross the high school stage in a borrowed gown. My hands ached from weeks of extra carpentry jobs, but the envelope in my jacket held a check big enough to cover his first semester of college. He hugged me in the parking lot, the fabric of his gown smelling faintly of starch and dust. "Couldn't have done it without you, Dad," he'd said. I believed him. When his car broke down the winter after graduation, I spent 3 nights in the cold fixing it. Engine grease under my nails, the scent of antifreeze sharp in my nose. He barely looked up from his phone when I handed him the keys. I kept giving. Every spare dollar, every hour I could pull from my own life, I poured into his. I told myself it was what fathers do. 2 years ago, he called with the house listing. I found the one, he'd said, voice brighter than I'd heard in months. A 3-bedroom on Willow Street, peeling paint but solid bones. He needed a co-signer, of course. I signed the papers at the county office, the ink barely dry before he tossed me the keys like it was a shared victory. For a while it was. Thanksgiving dinners in that kitchen, the smell of turkey and sage stuffing spilling into the hall. But I noticed the little things. The way he left my name off the mailbox. The look he gave when I offered to fix the porch railing, as if I was in the way. Tonight, his words had stripped it all bare. $10. No place here. As the lodge's dark silhouette rose in the distance, I felt the weight of those years settle in my chest like cold stone. By the second winter in that Willow Street house, I'd stopped bringing my overnight bag. The guest room, the one I'd painted pale blue myself, was suddenly Camilla's office. A desk piled with glossy magazines, a ring light in the corner casting its cold glow over everything. When I did stay for dinner, the table felt smaller somehow. They sat close, whispering between bites, while my plate cooled in front of me. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary couldn't hide the fact I wasn't part of the conversation. It was in the small exchanges that the shift showed. One afternoon, I stopped by with a box of my old tools. Trevor met me on the porch, his smile polite but thin. "We've already got a toolbox," he said, pushing the box back toward me with one hand. The metal clinked inside, each sound sharper than it should have been. At Christmas, I gave them a quilt I'd spent weeks sewing. Soft flannel, deep green and cream, stitched with the same pattern my mother had taught me. Camilla unfolded it, ran her hand over the fabric once, then set it on the couch without a word. The smell of cinnamon cider filled the room, but all I could taste was the bitterness on my tongue. By spring, my visits were shorter. I noticed how Trevor no longer asked about the lodge, no longer offered to stop by for a cup of coffee. When I mentioned repairs, he waved it off, eyes already on his phone. It was as if my world existed on a different map entirely. Then came the day I saw the realtor's card on the kitchen counter. A smiling headshot, bold letters. "Let's get it sold." I picked it up, feeling the glossy paper stick to my fingertips. Camilla swept in from the hallway, snatched the card, and dropped it in a drawer. "Just exploring options," she said, her voice light, but her eyes fixed anywhere but on me. Those moments stacked like kindling, each one small on its own, but together enough to build a fire. I didn't know when it would ignite, only that it would. As I trudged up the last hill toward the lodge that night, snow crunching under my boots, I could see the faint outline of the porch through the trees. A place still mine, a place they hadn't touched. The key in my pocket felt heavier than ever, as if it carried not just brass and weight, but the years between what was and what is. It happened on a gray Saturday morning in late March. I'd stopped by Willow Street with a bag of fresh bread from the bakery. Still warm, the smell of yeast and rosemary clinging to the paper. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, the steady tap-tap echoing in the still air. Trevor opened the door halfway. Behind him, Camilla's voice floated in from the kitchen, sharp as the clatter of dishes. I held out the bread. "Thought you might like this?" I said. His eyes flicked to the bag, then back to me. "We're fine," he muttered. He didn't take it. Instead, he stepped onto the porch, pulling the door nearly shut behind him. I noticed he was wearing the leather jacket I'd given him at 20. The one I'd worked overtime to buy. It looked good on him, but he wore it like it had nothing to do with me. "What's going on?" I asked. He shifted his weight, jaw tightening. "Dad, you don't need to keep showing up. It's awkward." "Camilla thinks it's weird." Something in my chest tightened. "Weird to bring you bread," I said. He gave a quick laugh, short, cold. "No. Weird to act like you're still part of things here." The words landed like a slap. Still part of things. As if fatherhood had an expiration date. I felt the air on the porch grow heavier. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The wind carried the faint scent of damp earth from the thawing yard. "I'm your father," I said quietly. He shrugged, eyes sliding away. "Yeah, but that doesn't mean you have to insert yourself into everything. You had your time. Now let us have ours." The door behind him creaked open. Camilla leaned out, her perfume sweet and cloying in the cold air. "Trevor, we're going to be late," she said. Her gaze flicked over me like I was just another piece of porch furniture. Then she smiled, tight, polite, before disappearing inside. Trevor stepped back toward the door. "You should head home, Dad," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, and maybe stop bringing stuff. We don't need handouts. Oh, handouts. The word rang in my ears long after the door closed. I stood there a moment, the warm bread cooling in my hands, steam fading into the morning chill. Walking back down the steps, I caught my reflection in the living room window, a man holding a gift no one wanted. The porch light clicked off above me. The house looked the same as it always had, but I knew something in it had shifted for good. 3 days later, I saw them again, this time at Miller's Hardware. I'd stopped in for wood stain and a box of screws. The smell of sawdust and motor oil thick in the warm air. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, catching specks in the beams like gold flecks in water. I was leaning over the counter, counting out change for Earl, when Trevor's voice cut through the quiet. "Hey, look who's here," he said to the man beside him. A friend from high school I barely remembered. "Still hanging around town, Dad. Guess you don't have anywhere better to be." The words came with a grin, but the kind that carried no warmth. Earl glanced at me, then quickly looked down at the register. I straightened, the coins in my palm suddenly cold. Trevor's friend chuckled. "Didn't know you two still saw each other," he said. Trevor shrugged. "Yeah, he drops by. Brings stuff we don't need. Old habits. You know? Old habits." As if generosity was some kind of sickness I hadn't shaken, I slid the coins across the counter. Earl's hand brushed mine, a silent apology he couldn't say out loud. I picked up the bag of supplies, the paper crinkling under my fingers. Walking toward the door, I heard Trevor behind me. "See you around, Dad. Try not to buy anything for us this time." A laughter followed, low but sharp enough to catch in my back like a splinter. Outside, the cold air hit me hard. The scent of fresh cut lumber from the loading dock mixed with exhaust fumes. I crossed the lot slowly, the bag swinging at my side, each step echoing in the hollow space between who we were and who we'd become. At the truck I'd borrowed from Earl for the week, I set the bag in the passenger seat. For a long moment, I just stood there, watching my breath fog the glass. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them, loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear, shaping me into a figure of pity. I thought about the lodge key again, about the quiet space waiting at the edge of the mountain. It was the one place where his voice couldn't reach me. Sliding into the driver's seat, I gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. Not from rage, not yet, from something steadier. The kind of resolve that doesn't need to announce itself. Not today. But soon. It was late afternoon when Trevor showed up at the lodge. The snow on the porch steps was still packed from last night's wind, crunching under his boots as he climbed. He didn't call ahead, just appeared with a manila folder tucked under his arm, and that restless energy I'd learned to distrust. "Got a minute, Dad?" he asked, brushing snow from his jacket. He didn't wait for an answer, stepping inside like the place was his. The scent of pine logs burning in the fireplace filled the room, but his cologne cut through it, sharp, unfamiliar. He laid the folder on the kitchen table, spreading out several sheets of paper. "Nothing complicated," he said, tapping the top page. "Just some updates for the insurance, a couple of signatures. Standard stuff." I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket, the frames still cold from being outside. The first page looked harmless enough, addresses, policy numbers. But halfway down, a paragraph caught my eye. Transfer of beneficiary. I kept my voice even. "What's this?" Trevor smiled like it was nothing. "Just makes things easier if anything happens to you. Camilla's good with this kind of paperwork," but his tone was casual, but his fingers drummed on the table. Too quick, too tight. I flipped to the next page. It wasn't insurance at all. It was an authorization form for a joint account I didn't remember opening. The date in the corner was barely a month old. The room felt warmer suddenly, the fire popping in the hearth behind me. But there was a cold spot in my chest that even the heat couldn't touch. "You've been in my accounts," I said quietly. Trevor's smile faltered. "Dad, it's not like that. It's just, things move faster if I can handle them for you." I set the paper down, the scratch of it against the wood sounding too loud. "How much?" I asked. He looked away, jaw shifting. "Don't make it a big deal." In my head, I pictured the statements I hadn't checked in weeks. The lodge repairs. The winter heating bills I'd paid in cash. And now, maybe, something missing I couldn't yet name. Trevor pushed the pen toward me. "Just sign it. It'll save trouble later." The pen rolled to a stop in front of me, its silver clip catching the last bit of afternoon light. I leaned back, the chair creaking under my weight. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Somewhere in the trees, a branch cracked under the weight of snow. I didn't pick up the pen. Instead, I slid the papers back into the folder and closed it with one slow motion. "I'll think about it," I said. The look he gave me wasn't disappointment. It was calculation. When he left, the lodge felt quieter than usual, as if the air itself had been holding its breath. I stayed at the table, the faint smell of his cologne lingering long after the sound of his truck faded down the mountain road. The sun had dipped low behind the ridge, casting the lodge in a wash of blue shadow. I sat at the kitchen table with the manila folder still in front of me, its edges curling slightly from the heat of the fire. The silence pressed in, broken only by the faint tick of the wall clock. I reached for the old tin box on the top shelf, the one where I kept bank statements, receipts, and the spare checkbook. The metal was cold in my hands. I set it down carefully, like the sound might wake something I wasn't ready to face. Pulling the laptop closer, I logged into my online banking. The loading wheel spun longer than it should have, each second winding the knot in my chest tighter. The numbers blinked onto the screen. At first glance, it didn't seem wrong. But I knew my balance by heart, and this wasn't it. 2 withdrawals stood out, both made on weekdays I'd been at the lodge, both from a branch in town I hadn't visited in months. I clicked through to the images of the withdrawal slips. The signature, it was mine, but not mine. Close enough to fool a teller who wasn't looking too hard. Leaning back, I rubbed my thumb along the grain of the table. I thought of Trevor's tapping fingers earlier, the way he'd avoided my eyes. This wasn't carelessness. This was a plan. I dug deeper. Credit card statements, utilities, even the small savings account I kept for lodge maintenance. A few payments had been rerouted. Vague descriptions, processing fee, service transfer, all just small enough to slip by unnoticed, but together they added up to more than I'd spent all winter. The fire popped behind me, sending up a brief spray of sparks. I didn't turn around. I couldn't shake the image of Trevor and Camila, sitting at their kitchen table, plotting the paperwork I just refused to sign. I pulled a legal pad toward me and began jotting dates, amounts, names of tellers I recognized from the slips. My handwriting came out tighter than usual. Letters cramped together like they were holding their breath. By the time I closed the laptop, the wind outside had picked up, whistling through the eaves like a warning. I slid the tin box back onto the shelf, then tucked the legal pad into the locked drawer of my desk. Standing at the window, I watched the tree line sway against the night sky. Snow was coming again. You could smell it in the air, sharp and clean. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. You don't tip your hand before you know the whole game. And now I knew enough to see this was only the beginning. By mid-April, the calls had nearly stopped. If Trevor rang, it was short, questions about mail or a bill. Never about how I was doing. The gaps between those calls stretched like the long, empty road up the mountain. One Friday evening, I drove past Willow Street on my way back from town. Lights glowed in every window. Through the sheer curtains, I caught a glimpse of a crowded table, laughter spilling out when the door opened for a guest. The smell of grilled meat drifted down the block, mixing with the faint scent of lilacs from the yard. I kept driving. Easter came and went without an invitation. I'd baked a pie anyway. Apple, my mother's recipe. It sat untouched on the counter, the buttery crust cooling in the draft from the window. The ticking of the clock filled the kitchen, each second heavier than the last. Days blurred. The lodge was quiet except for the groan of the old floorboards and the hiss of the kettle in the mornings. I walked the property more than usual, checking the shed, the fence line, anything to fill the hours. Sometimes I caught myself listening for the crunch of tires on the gravel drive, hoping for a visitor who never came. Then one afternoon there was a knock. Not the hard, rushed knock Trevor used, but a light, quick rhythm. When I opened the door, Lily stood there, hair tucked under a knit cap, cheeks pink from the wind. In her hands, a paper bag bulged with oranges. "Thought you might like these," she said, stepping inside. The citrus scent filled the room instantly, cutting through the faint mustiness of wood smoke and winter air. She set the bag on the counter, glancing around like she was checking the place for dust. "You haven't been down in a while," she said. I shrugged. "Haven't been invited." And she frowned but didn't push. Instead, she pulled 2 mugs from the cupboard, filling them with the tea I kept for guests. The steam curled between us, softening the edges of the silence. For the next hour, we sat at the table, talking about her classes, the stray cat she'd adopted, and how she couldn't stand Camila's new obsession with matching dinnerware. Her voice was a balm I didn't realize I needed. Steady, unhurried, familiar. When she left, the kitchen felt bigger somehow, as if her presence had pushed the walls back. I stood at the window watching her car disappear down the drive, the scent of oranges lingering in the air. The quiet returned, but it didn't sting quite as much that night. 2 weeks later, I learned from a neighbor that Trevor had hosted a barbecue. Half the family was there. Cousins, uncles, even friends from out of state. No one called me. No one thought to mention it. That night, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, watching the lights from town flicker on the horizon. The spring air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke drifting from far-off chimneys. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a reminder of how far I'd been pushed out. The next day, my phone buzzed with a text from Trevor. Need the lawnmower back. No greeting. No question. Just that. I typed a reply, then deleted it. By sunset, he showed up without knocking, rolled the mower out of the shed, and drove off without a word. The sound of the engine faded fast, leaving only the wind in the trees. Lily came the following weekend. She brought blueberry muffins still warm from her oven. The sweet, buttery smell filled the lodge, seeping into the wood and fabric like sunlight after a storm. She set them on the counter and poured herself a glass of milk. "You hear about Uncle Trevor's barbecue?" she asked, eyes narrowing when I shook my head. "Figures," she muttered. Then, softer, "You didn't miss much." But I knew she was lying to make me feel better. We sat by the fireplace while rain tapped against the windows. She told me about a painting she was working on, wildflowers on a hillside, the colors bright enough to burn away a gray day. I listened, letting her voice fill the empty spaces in the room. When she left, she pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. "Call me if you need anything. I mean it." Her handwriting was quick and slanted. The ink smudged in one corner. I tucked it into my wallet like a lifeline. A few days later, the mailbox held a thick envelope from the county office. Inside was a property tax notice, addressed to Trevor, but with the lodge listed as the primary residence. I read it twice, the paper crackling in my hands. No explanation, no conversation. I set the envelope on the desk and stared at it until the light outside turned to dusk. The only sound was the slow tick of the clock and the occasional pop from the cooling stove. It was clear now. Trevor and Camilla weren't just keeping their distance. They were rearranging the ground beneath my feet. That night, I left the porch light on longer than usual. Just in case Lily decided to drop by, she didn't. But the light stayed burning until morning. The town hall smelled faintly of floor wax and burnt coffee. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table draped in a white cloth, its edges curling from years of use. I'd come for the spring fundraiser, the kind of thing I'd attended for decades, back when my name still meant something here. Trevor and Camilla were already working the room when I arrived. She wore a bright red dress, the kind that caught every eye. He had that easy smile he used in business meetings, but it tightened the moment he saw me. "Dad," he said, drawing the word out just enough to sound forced. "You made it." Camilla's hand slid onto his arm. "We weren't sure you'd feel up to it," she added, her voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby table to hear. I took a seat near the back, close to the coffee urn. The bitter scent of overbrewed grounds drifted up, mingling with the smell of sugar cookies from the bake sale table. I sipped in silence, watching them make their rounds. Halfway through the evening, Trevor stepped up to the microphone. The chatter dimmed. "Thanks for coming, everyone," he began, his voice smooth. "I want to take a moment to thank all the folks who've really contributed to this town." His eyes scanned the crowd, pausing just a beat too long on me. He went on, naming business owners, volunteers, even a teenager who'd organized a car wash. When he reached the end, he smiled in my direction. "And of course, we're all grateful to my dad for showing up tonight. It's good to see you out." A few people chuckled. Not cruelly, but awkwardly, the way you laugh when you're not sure if it's a joke. My ears burned. Camilla clapped slowly, her bracelets jangling in the hush. "That's right," she said. "Let's give him a hand. It's not easy making it down from the mountains these days." The applause was polite, thin. I could feel eyes on me, some sympathetic, others curious. I forced a small nod, pretending the floor wasn't tilting under my feet. As the raffle tickets were drawn, I slipped out to the hallway. The linoleum was cool under my boots, the hum of the soda machine filling the quiet. From the main room I heard Trevor's voice again, but the words blurred into a low drone. I leaned against the wall, breathing slow. It wasn't the first time they'd chipped away at me in public, but this was the most deliberate. It wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about erasing me in front of the people who used to know me. As I turned toward the exit, my coat brushed against the inside pocket. The folded envelope was still there. The one with copies of the bank statements, withdrawal slips, and the property tax notice in Trevor's name. The edges were worn soft from handling, but the paper inside was crisp. I'd brought it tonight out of habit, not planning to use it. But feeling it there now, I realized something. They thought they were playing the only game. They didn't know I'd already started my own. I stayed in the hallway longer than I meant to, letting the cool air settle my pulse. Through the open doors, Trevor's laugh rose above the hum of conversation. Camilla's voice followed, lilting and bright, like nothing unpleasant had ever crossed her mind. When I finally stepped back in, the raffle was over and people were milling about. Trevor stood near the front. A small cluster gathered around him. He was telling a story, something about closing a big deal in record time, his hands moving like he was painting the air. Camilla leaned on his arm, nodding at every word. I moved along the edge of the room, keeping to the shadows by the coat racks. The scent of perfume and floor polish mixed in the air, thick and a little too sweet. Every so often, someone glanced my way, but no one called me over. Lily appeared from the crowd, her blue scarf trailing behind her like a ribbon. She held 2 paper cups of coffee, steam curling into the warm room. "Hair," she said, pressing one into my hand. Her fingers were warm, her eyes steady. I saw what they did. She added, low enough that it was almost swallowed by the chatter. I tried to brush it off. Just words. She shook her head. No, it was more than that. They wanted people to see you as less. The coffee was bitter, but it grounded me. "Why tell me this?" I asked. She glanced toward Trevor, then back at me. "Because I think you're not as helpless as they think. And when the time comes, I want you to know I'll help." Her words sat between us like a promise. She didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any. But the envelope in my coat pocket felt heavier now, almost alive. Across the room, Trevor caught my eye and smiled, the polite kind you give a stranger. He had no idea Lily was watching him with quiet defiance, no idea she'd already stepped across an invisible line. Camilla began gathering her things, her bracelets clinking as she tucked them into a sequined clutch. She waved to me as if we were on easy terms, a quick flick of her fingers before she turned away. I finished the coffee in slow sips, watching the crowd thin out. The sound of chairs scraping the floor echoed in the high ceiling. Someone laughed near the door, the sharp edge of it carrying long after the rest of the noise faded. When it was time to leave, Lily walked with me to the parking lot. The night air was crisp, smelling faintly of wet pavement and gasoline from the idling cars. Street lamps cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. At my truck, she touched my arm. "Call me if you need to," she said again. This time it wasn't just kindness, it was solidarity. I watched her drive away, the taillights disappearing into the dark. Then I stood there for a moment, hands in my pockets, fingers brushing the folded papers. Inside, the anger from earlier had cooled into something sharper. They might have won the room tonight, but the game wasn't over. The night after the fundraiser, the lodge felt colder than usual. Wind pushed against the windows, rattling the panes. I built a fire, but the heat seemed to stay near the hearth. The rest of the room was shadows and cool air. I sat at the desk in the corner, pulling open the bottom drawer. The key scraped in the lock, a sound I hadn't heard in months. Inside were folders, bank statements, and the leather-bound ledger I'd kept for years. I spread them across the desk. The paper smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. Each page crackled when I turned it. Dates, amounts, notations in my own handwriting, all steady until last fall. That's when the numbers began to shift. Several deposits were smaller than they should have been. A few withdrawals were listed twice, each with a slightly different date. I wrote them down on a yellow pad, my pen scratching in the quiet. I reached for the metal lockbox on the top shelf. Its weight settled heavy in my hands. Inside, beneath the old deed and my will, was a thick envelope I didn't recognize. No return address. The flap was sealed with a strip of clear tape. I sliced it open with my pocket knife. A faint scent of copier toner and stale air escaped. Inside were photocopies, informs from the county recorder's office, the lodge's property file. But something was wrong. On the third page, beneath my signature from years ago, was a recent amendment. It listed Trevor Hayes as secondary manager of the property, effective 3 months prior. My name was still there, but the wording allowed him to make urgent financial decisions without my consent. The date of filing matched the week he'd shown up with that manila folder. I set the page down slowly, my fingers leaving faint creases in the paper. Somewhere in the trees outside, an owl called, low and steady. I flipped through the rest. There was also a notarized form authorizing a new joint account, linked directly to the lodge's operating funds. The signature was mine in shape only, a poor copy of my hand. The fire popped behind me, sending a brief wave of heat across my back. I didn't move. The edges of the pages felt sharper now, as if they'd been cut to draw blood. I stacked the copies neatly, slid them back into the envelope, and tucked it under the ledger. The legal pad with my notes stayed on the desk. I'd need it close. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried the scent of snow from higher up the ridge. The night pressed in against the windows, and I let it. Better to keep the world small until I knew exactly how deep this ran. The next morning, I left before sunrise. Frost clung to the truck's windshield, and my breath hung in the air as I scraped it clear. The lodge sat behind me in shadow, chimney smoke curling into the pale sky. The county recorder's office opened at 8. I was there by 7:45, hands deep in my coat pockets. Inside, the air smelled of paper, ink, and burnt coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. A clerk with silver glasses looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" she asked. I slid the envelope across the counter. These were filed under my property. I need to verify them. She flipped through the pages, her brow tightening. "This amendment was filed in person," she said, "not by mail." As she pointed to a line, "The notary is local. It shows your signature from December." "It's not mine," I said. Her eyes lingered on me, measuring the weight of those words. "I can make you certified copies," she offered. "Good," I said. "And I'll need the filing dates for every change in the last year." Her fingers tapped on the keyboard, each stroke sharp in the quiet room. When she handed me the copies, the paper was warm from the printer. Dates and initials lined the margins, clear enough to see Trevor's visits marked in ink. He'd been here twice without telling me. From there, I drove straight to the bank. The lobby smelled of lemon polish and fresh bills. Behind the counter, a young teller smiled. I asked for the branch manager. A few minutes later, a man in a navy suit appeared, shaking my hand with practiced ease. In his office, I laid out the notarized form linking Trevor to the lodge's account. His smile faded as he scanned it. "This signature," he said, "was verified by one of our staff. They must have compared it to the card on file." He pulled my signature card from a drawer. Side by side, the difference was obvious. Mine steady and slanted, the other stiff, uneven. "Can you tell me when this account was accessed?" I asked. He typed into his computer. "Several withdrawals in January and February. Always from the downtown branch, and always in person." I left with another envelope, this one full of transaction records. The weight of it sat heavy in my coat as I walked back to the truck. The drive up the mountain was quiet. Snow flurries swirled across the road, melting the moment they touched the windshield. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, even as my mind replayed each date, each signature. By the time I pulled into the lodge drive, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. The air smelled of pine and the faint sweetness of wood smoke. I carried the envelopes inside, set them on the desk, and locked the door behind me. The fire hadn't been lit yet, so the room held the chill of the day. I stood there for a moment, looking at the stack of proof. It was more than I'd hoped to find, and worse than I'd wanted to know. Outside, darkness pooled in the trees. I let it. It matched what I was carrying now. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. I sat in the armchair, the envelopes on the table beside me. The paper inside seemed louder than the wind outside. Every creak of the lodge felt amplified in the quiet. The beams groaned as the temperature dropped. The pine boards popped softly, settling into the night. I should have gone to bed hours ago, but my mind wouldn't settle. The proof was there. The dates, signatures, withdrawals, all pointing to Trevor's hand. It wasn't anger keeping me awake now. It was something colder, sharper. A need to decide what came next. Outside, the wind swept through the trees, rattling the loose shutter on the north wall. The sound took me back decades. A winter night in my father's house. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table, a ledger open, explaining the difference between fighting to win and waiting for the right moment. "Noise burns out fast," he'd said, pushing a mug of coffee toward me. "Patience cuts deeper. People never see it coming." I could almost smell that coffee now. Bitter, strong, mixed with the faint scent of the old wood stove. The memory settled in my chest like an anchor. I rose and crossed to the desk. The envelopes slid easily into the bottom drawer. I locked it, slipped the key into my pocket. No one else would touch them. From the cupboard, I took the small notebook I used for repair lists. Tonight, it would hold something else. I wrote a single word at the top of the first page. Then I listed what I knew, what I could prove, and what I still needed. The fire hissed as another log split, sending sparks up the chimney. I paused, listening to the quiet between the sounds. It felt heavier than the night outside. I thought about calling Lily, but it was too late. Better to keep her out of the next part, at least until I knew how far I'd have to go. By 2 a.m., my handwriting filled 3 pages. Names, dates, offices to visit. A few reminders about who still owed me favors in town. I underlined one line twice, stay quiet until the last step. When the clock struck 3, I closed the notebook and placed it in the desk. The lodge had cooled, and my breath showed faintly in the air. I stood by the window, watching the snow begin to fall in slow, measured flakes. They thought I'd fade into the background. But I'd been here longer than any of them, and I knew the ground better. It was time to start moving pieces. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Streetlights slipped through the thin curtains, painting the room in pale amber. I lay on my back, eyes open, the ceiling a flat sheet of shadow. My heartbeat sounded louder than it should, steady but restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Henry's face earlier that week, calm, almost casual, as if taking something from me was no more than signing a receipt. My jaw tightened against the memory. In that stillness, Martin's voice came back to me. Never show them the weight they put on your back, Estelle. Straighten it instead. It had been years since I heard him say it. Tonight it felt alive, whispering along the walls. I rolled to my side, the sheet twisting around my legs. The clock on the dresser glowed 2:47 a.m. My mouth was dry. The air held the faint scent of lavender from the sachet Emily tucked under my pillow last Christmas. She was the only one who remembered I liked that smell. I let it anchor me. My mind began lining things up. The bank branch on Main Street. What time did it open? What documents were in the folder behind the bookshelf? I could see the green cover in my mind, its edges frayed from years of use. Somewhere inside was my proof. My leverage. I didn't need to move tonight, but I needed to know I could. I got up quietly, bare feet pressing into the cool hardwood. The hallway stretched longer than usual, shadows folding over each other. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of water. The gurgle of the tap filled the stillness. My reflection in the window looked like a ghost. Pale, hair loose on my shoulders, eyes sharper than they'd been in months. Back in bed, I didn't try to sleep. I let the plan settle in my bones. No sudden moves, no warnings. Just small, invisible steps until the day I chose to surface the truth. Henry and Rachel would never see it coming. The thought didn't make me smile, but it loosened something tight in my chest. A knot untying. Outside, a car rolled slowly down the street. Its headlights slid over the wall, then faded. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, listening to the house breathe. In the darkness, I whispered to Martin, "I'll do it my way. Quiet, but we'll hold." The clock ticked past 400 a.m. Dawn would come soon, soft and unhurried. When it did, I'd rise like nothing had changed. But I would know this night had built the first brick of my return. Morning came with a pale light spreading across the lodge walls. The fire from last night had gone cold, leaving only a faint ash smell in the air. I moved quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't draw attention, even from yourself. The envelopes stayed locked in the desk. I didn't need them today, only the assurance they were there. Instead, I pulled the green folder from behind the bookshelf. Its edges were worn soft, the color faded to sage. Inside were property maps, receipts, and the original deed, all still in my name. I laid them out on the kitchen table. The wood was cool under my hands. Sunlight caught the dust motes in the air, turning them gold. Every so often, the fridge clicked on. A small reminder the outside world still existed. I made a list, 3 columns, what I had, what I needed. Who might talk? The first column filled easily. The second took more thought. The third I kept short. Too many names meant too many risks. By 9 I was in town. The diner on Main Street smelled of bacon and burnt toast. I slid into a booth in the back, ordered black coffee, and waited. 2 old friends still worked here, Clara on the register, Joe at the counter. Both owed me small favors from years ago. Nothing written down but remembered. When Clara brought the coffee, she leaned closer. "Haven't seen you in a while," she said. I just nodded. "I'll need to know if Trevor's been asking about me," I murmured. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. "I'll keep my ears open," she said. Before moving on, I sipped the coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through my chest. This was step 1. Tighten the circle. Only those who'd notice small changes, and only those who could keep their mouths shut. From the diner, I walked to the post office. Inside, it smelled of paper dust and cold air. I asked the clerk to hold any mail marked confidential for in-person pickup. She didn't ask why. Small towns have a way of not asking questions when you don't want them to. By noon, I was back at the lodge. Snow had started to fall, soft flakes drifting against the porch rail. I took the shovel from the shed and cleared the steps, not because they needed it, but because routine makes people think nothing's changed. In the afternoon, I went through the lodge's storage closet. Every box was labeled, every tool in its place. I moved the valuables, old coins, my father's watch, into a locked cabinet. Not paranoia, just caution. As evening settled, I sat by the fire with a legal pad. I drew a rough map of connections, names, dates, places. Every arrow was a path to watch or block. The sound of the fire crackling filled the room, steady and patient. It was the same patience my father spoke about, the same patience I'd heard in Martin's advice. Wait until the pieces are where you want them. Then move once, but move fully. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the tracks I'd made that morning. By the time night came, the path to the porch looked untouched. Exactly how I wanted the next weeks to look. Nothing disturbed, nothing unusual, until it was too late for anyone to undo it. The next morning, I kept my routine. Coffee at the kitchen table. Firewood brought in from the shed. The sound of the kettle was the only noise in the house. Nothing that would draw suspicion if someone happened to drop by. Mid-morning, I called the utility company. I asked to update contact information and mailing addresses for every service tied to the lodge. The woman on the line had a bright voice, too cheerful for the hour. She read back each account, and I confirmed them slowly, carefully. Trevor's name was nowhere to be found. Good. But now, it never would be. By noon, I was parked outside the bank. The lot was nearly empty. The sky low and gray. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish. I asked for the branch manager again, this time with a polite smile and a folder in my hand. We sat in his office, door closed. I'd like to adjust access to certain accounts, I said. My voice stayed steady, no tremor, no hint of urgency. He glanced at the paperwork I'd prepared and nodded. Within 15 minutes, I had new passwords, updated PNs, and a note in the system that no changes could be made without my physical presence. Driving back up the mountain, the snow was deeper, the road slick under the tires. The trees leaned over the lane, their branches heavy with white. It felt like the world was closing in, making my movements invisible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. At the lodge, I locked the truck, then carried 2 grocery bags inside. They weren't just food. Inside was a new locking file box and a small flash drive. Both would hold copies of the documents I'd gathered. The originals would stay hidden here. The copies would go somewhere no one could touch. That afternoon, I made calls to 2 people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old business contacts. One still worked at the insurance agency in town. The other handled estate paperwork for half the valley. I didn't tell them much. Just enough to know they'd pick up the phone if I called again. As the day dimmed, I stood at the front window. The snow had erased the tracks from my earlier trip. The world outside looked untouched. Inside, the fire glowed low, the air warm with cedar and ash. I sat at the desk and opened the green folder again. One by one, I scanned each document onto the flash drive. The scanner made a soft hum, the light bar sliding under each page. The sound was almost soothing. When I finished, I tucked the drive into my pocket and closed the folder. The weight of it felt lighter now, as if some of the burden had shifted. By nightfall, the lodge was silent again. The kind of silence that holds space for thought. I looked at the fire, then at the locked drawer where the envelopes sat. Each piece was in place. The circle was tight. The exits were mine to control. Outside, the snow kept falling. It covered the world in a smooth, unbroken sheet. That was the image I wanted, a surface so calm no one suspected what lay beneath. And when the time came to break it, the crack would be loud enough to carry down the whole mountain. The day started like any other. Cold air spilling in from the porch when I stepped outside. The smell of pine sharp in my lungs. Snow crunching under my boots as I carried in the wood. But inside, I knew this was the day. Every step, every quiet move I'd made these past weeks had led here. The pieces were set. There would be no second chance. I dressed carefully, dark slacks, a pressed shirt. The wool coat Martin gave me our last Christmas together. The fabric was still soft, still warm with the memory of his hands folding it for me. I slipped the green folder into my leather bag, its weight familiar, almost steadying. Driving into town, the roads were plowed but slick. Sunlight flashed off ice patches, making the edges of the pines glow white. My hands stayed tight on the wheel. I rehearsed the words in my head, not too sharp, not too soft. Just enough to cut clean. At the bank, the air inside was warm and dry. The manager saw me and waved me into his office without a word. I set the folder on his desk and opened it. "This," I said, "is the complete record of my property and accounts." I slid another envelope toward him. "And this is the list of unauthorized changes made over the past year. I want them reversed." Today, he read quickly, eyes narrowing. When he looked up, there was a new tone in his voice. We can initiate that now, he said, but it will mean freezing certain access immediately. I nodded once. That's the idea. While he worked, I stared at the snow falling outside the window. Each flake landed without sound, yet together they were enough to slow the whole street. Quiet pressure. It was the same principle I'd been living by. An hour later, the papers were signed, the accounts locked to my name alone, property title corrections filed. It was done. The quiet kind of done. The kind that looked like nothing from the outside. When I stepped back into the cold, the sun had moved higher, casting long shadows from the buildings onto the snow. My breath came out in a slow cloud. The wind bit at my cheeks, but underneath my coat I was warm. I didn't go home yet. Not until the next step was ready. Trevor and Rachel still thought they had time. By the end of today, they would know different. I parked 2 houses down from theirs, engine idling for a moment. The cold air seeped through the door seals, crisp and sharp. I could see the warm glow of their living room from here, shadows moving across the curtains. They didn't know I was coming. When I stepped onto their porch, the wind caught the hem of my coat. I knocked once. Rachel opened the door, her smile freezing when she saw me. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her tone was flat, already defensive. "I need to speak to both of you," I said. Before she could answer, Trevor appeared in the hallway. He looked surprised, then annoyed. "This isn't a good time." "It's exactly the right time," I replied, stepping inside. The smell of cinnamon and coffee hit me, warm and cloying against the chill I'd brought in. I took off my gloves slowly, letting the silence stretch. They stood together by the sofa, their eyes flicking to the leather bag I carried. "I've just come from the bank," I began. "All accounts are now locked under my name alone. Property records have been corrected. Effective immediately. You have no access to my funds or assets." Rachel's mouth opened, then shut. Trevor's face flushed red. "You can't just— I can," I said, cutting him off. And I did. "This is your copy of the changes." I placed the envelope on the coffee table, the sound louder than it should have been. Rachel stepped forward, her voice rising. "You're making a mistake. We were only trying to help." I held her gaze. Help doesn't come with hidden withdrawals and forged signatures. The room went quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. Trevor shifted his weight, looking down at the carpet. I could see the calculations running through his mind. He'd been sure I wouldn't notice. He'd been sure I couldn't fight back. I put my gloves back on, slow and deliberate. "You'll have until the end of the week to remove anything you own from the lodge. After that, the locks change." Rachel's eyes widened. "You wouldn't." "I would," I said, and then I turned toward the door. The cold outside was a relief, biting at my skin, clearing the heavy air from my lungs. Behind me, the muffled sound of their voices rose and fell, a mix of anger and panic. It no longer mattered what they said. The choice was out of their hands. The drive back up the mountain felt lighter than I expected. Snow lined the road in clean white banks, the sky a pale blue stretching far over the ridge. Each turn of the tires felt like putting distance between myself and the weight they had placed on me. At the lodge, the air inside was warmer than I'd left it. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, filling the room with the faint smell of cedar. I hung up my coat, set the leather bag on the desk, and for the first time in months, let my shoulders drop. But the day wasn't over. I pulled the phone from the drawer and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. When the voice answered, low and steady, I spoke plainly. "It's done. You can file the final paperwork. And I'd like the notice sent to them by certified mail." There was no need for more detail. The silence on the other end told me they understood. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the rich smell filling the kitchen as snow began falling again outside. Through the window, I watched the flakes blur the edge of the pines, softening the whole landscape. It felt fitting, the world covering its tracks as I had covered mine. By mid-afternoon I had cleared the desk of anything I didn't want others to see. The green folder went back into its place, the lock on the drawer clicking shut. Every copy was accounted for, the flash drive already in its safe spot miles away. A knock at the door startled me. Emily stood there, cheeks pink from the cold. "Grandma, did you do something?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. I smiled faintly. "Just setting things right." She didn't press, but her eyes lingered, as if she knew there was more under the surface. We sat by the fire, mugs in hand, the quiet between us comfortable. Emily talked about school, about her plans for the spring. I listened, letting her words fill the spaces that had been empty for too long. When evening came, I walked her to her car. The snow was deeper now, crunching under our boots, our breath clouding the air. She hugged me tightly before leaving, and I held on a little longer than usual. Inside again, I stood in the center of the lodge. Everything felt still, but it was a different stillness than before. Not the kind born of waiting, but the kind that follows a door closing for good. I poured myself one last cup of coffee, sat at the desk, and opened the window just enough to let in the cold night air. It carried the clean scent of snow, and with it the knowledge that the fight was over, quiet, complete, exactly as I had planned. The morning after felt different. Not lighter, exactly, just clearer. As if the air had been rinsed clean overnight. The snow outside was untouched, a perfect sheet of white from the porch to the tree line. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the sunlight turn it all to a quiet shimmer. The phone rang mid-morning. I let it go to voicemail. When I finally listened, Trevor's voice was tight, almost clipped. "We need to talk," he said. There was no apology, no explanation, only need. I deleted the message without saving it. By noon, a certified letter arrived. The envelope was thick, official. I signed for it at the door, the postal carrier stamping the slip before handing it over. Inside was confirmation from my lawyer. Every change was recorded, every transfer reversed. The lodge, the accounts, the assets. All in my name, secured. I walked the length of the living room, the wooden floor creaking in familiar places. The fire had burned down to a bed of embers, casting a warm orange glow on the walls. I remembered the months I'd lived here under their shadow, tiptoeing through my own life as if I were a guest. That was over. In the afternoon I drove into town for groceries. The streets were half plowed, the edges of the sidewalks buried under snowbanks. Inside the market, Clara caught my arm. "Heard there was a bit of excitement yesterday," she said with a knowing glance. I smiled faintly. Just taking care of some unfinished business. As she didn't ask more, she didn't need to. On the way back, I passed their street. Rachel's SUV was gone. Trevor's truck sat crooked in the driveway. Snow piled on the hood as if it hadn't moved in days. The curtains were drawn tight. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing it for what it was. Not a place of power. Only walls and windows. Back at the lodge, I unloaded the groceries in silence. The smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen as I sliced a loaf for dinner. Each small act, unpacking, tidying, stoking the fire, felt like reclaiming a piece of the life they'd tried to bend. As evening settled in, I sat by the window with a blanket around my shoulders. The snow kept falling, flakes drifting lazily under the porch light. Somewhere in town, they were realizing just how permanent my actions had been. The thought didn't bring gloating, just a steady calm. I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet, not the tense, waiting quiet from before. This was the sound of space opening up, of time returning to me. For the first time in months, I felt like the ground under my feet was my own. The next day, a pale sun hung low over the ridge. Its light spilled across the snow, casting long blue shadows from the pines. I made a slow breakfast. Oatmeal with cinnamon, the scent drifting through the lodge. It felt good to cook without the weight of someone else's schedule pressing on me. Around mid-morning, I found Emily's note tucked under the front door. The paper was lined, her handwriting neat but quick. "Call me when you're ready. I'm proud of you." I read it twice before slipping it into the top drawer of the desk. Some words deserve to stay close. I spent the afternoon tending to the little things, mending the tear in the quilt, re-ironing the hinges on the pantry door, stacking the firewood so the neat rows felt like order in my hands. It wasn't about keeping busy. It was about settling back into a space that was mine, without anyone's permission. At one point, I stepped outside to shovel the steps. The cold air stung my cheeks, the snow squeaking under the shovel blade. I could see my breath curling up into the blue sky. From here, the valley looked endless. Patches of white fields, winding roads, and the faint plume of chimney smoke from houses miles away. It reminded me that the world was bigger than their reach had ever been. By late afternoon, I sat at the desk to sort through the last of the paperwork. The green folder went into the locked drawer, but the copies, those I placed in a plain cardboard box marked winter clothes. If someone ever came looking, they'd never guess what was inside. One more layer of quiet defense. Just before dusk, I brewed tea and sat near the fire. The flames popped softly, casting shadows that moved like slow dancers across the walls. I thought about the months ahead, the repairs I wanted to make to the porch, the spring planting I could do in the small garden out back. They were small plans, but they were mine alone. That evening, Emily called. Her voice was warm, with that slight edge of relief you hear when someone's been worried too long. "I'm coming up this weekend," she said. "I'll bring the cinnamon rolls you like." I laughed, the sound feeling freer than it had in years. "Good," I told her. It's about time this place smelled like home again. After the call, I stepped onto the porch one last time before bed. The night was clear, the stars sharp against the dark. The snow glistened under the moonlight, smooth and unbroken. I stood there for a long moment, hands in my pockets, breathing in the cold until my chest felt clean. When I finally went inside, the lodge welcomed me with its warmth. The quiet wrapped around me, not as an emptiness but as proof that peace could be claimed and kept on my own terms. Spring came slow to the mountains. The snow melted in thin ribbons along the driveway, revealing damp earth and the first shoots of green. Each morning, I opened the windows to let in the air. Cool, sharp, smelling faintly of pine and thawed soil. The lodge felt lighter with every breeze that passed through. I spent the early weeks clearing the garden. The soil was dark and rich under my hands, still cold but full of promise. I planted hardy herbs first, rosemary, thyme, mint, and lined the edges with marigolds for color. By afternoon the sun warmed my back, and I could hear the stream beyond the trees, its ice finally broken. Emily came up on weekends. She'd bring groceries, and that laugh of hers, that made the whole house feel alive. We'd cook together, simple meals, roast chicken, fresh bread, apple pie cooling on the sill. The smell lingered through the evening, mixing with the faint scent of wood smoke from the fire. One Saturday, she found the old rocking chair in the attic. The wood was worn smooth from years of use, and the cushion had faded to a soft blue-gray. We carried it to the porch. That afternoon I sat there with a book, watching the sun sink low over the valley, its light spilling gold across the pines. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed this, being still but not stuck. The town felt different now, too. When I went in for supplies, people waved from across the street. Clara at the diner always had my coffee ready before I sat down. There were no more whispers, no careful sidesteps around me. Whatever had happened between me and Trevor was no longer the town's concern. It was finished. One evening, Emily asked if I'd ever thought about renting out a few rooms for travelers. "People love a mountain retreat," she said, her eyes bright with ideas. I smiled at her enthusiasm. "I think I'd like that," I told her. The thought of sharing this space, on my terms, felt like the right kind of opening. That night, I stood on the porch after she left. The air was cool, the stars beginning to show. The garden lay quiet under the moonlight, rose neat and waiting for summer. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something I had to defend. It felt like something I could build. Summer arrived with the smell of wildflowers drifting through the open windows. The garden had filled out, rosemary sprigs brushing against my legs, marigolds blazing gold along the edges. The lodge no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a place that breathed with the seasons. By July, the first guests arrived. A couple from Denver looking for quiet. They spent mornings on the porch with coffee, afternoons hiking the ridge trails. In the evenings, we shared simple dinners. Grilled trout, fresh bread, berry cobbler. Their laughter carried through the rooms long after they'd gone to bed. Emily came every Friday. She'd bring baskets of fruit from the market, her hair catching the late sun as she walked up the path. Sometimes we'd sit at the kitchen table making jam, the air thick with the smell of simmering strawberries. Other nights we'd play cards by the fire until the logs burned low. The quiet between us had changed. It wasn't the hush of unspoken worries anymore. It was the peace of knowing we were safe. One afternoon, I found an envelope in the mailbox. No return address. Inside was a short note in Trevor's handwriting. No apology. Just a line that read, "We won't be back." I stood on the porch for a long time after reading it, watching the clouds drift over the peaks. When I finally tore the note in half, the wind carried the pieces away. Late in August, I hosted a small gathering for neighbors. We sat outside as the sun set, fireflies flickering in the tall grass. Stories and laughter filled the air, mingling with the low crackle of the fire pit. It struck me then how different life looked when you chose who to let in. That night after everyone left, I walked the garden path barefoot, feeling the cool earth under my feet. The stars were bright enough to cast faint shadows on the ground. I thought about all the mornings I'd woken here in fear, waiting for the next blow to fall. Now, each day began without that weight. Back inside, I poured a glass of water and stood at the window. The lodge glowed softly in the moonlight, its walls holding more than just shelter now. They held my history, my fight, and my quiet victory. This was the legacy I would leave behind, a life reclaimed, a home filled with choice and light. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and wild mint. I closed my eyes and let it fill me. The road behind me was sealed. The one ahead was wide and open, and I was ready to walk it.